On the morning of a fixing, a UBS trader in Tokyo typed a message to an interdealer broker. The request was specific. Push the cash desks toward a particular figure for 6-month yen. The message closed with an offer, a curry lunch, in exchange for the favor. The broker relayed the request to submitters at rival banks. Those submitters had, on that day, no yen borrowing to report. They had no transaction. They had an opinion, and the opinion was now for sale at the price of lunch. At 11 o'clock London time, the British Bankers Association published a single number derived from those opinions. Against that number, a notional value larger than global gross domestic product repriced. The question this episode answers is not whether the trader was wrong to send the message. The question is structural. How does a benchmark that governs an estimated $350 trillion in financial contracts come to be set by an unverified estimate, submitted by a party with a position in the outcome with no transaction required to anchor it? That is the mechanism. We begin there. The London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR. To understand the fraud, you must first understand what the number was supposed to measure and how it was constructed to measure it. LIBOR was, in its definition, an answer to a question. The British Bankers Association posed that question each business day to a panel of contributor banks. The question was as follows: at what rate could you borrow funds? Were you to do so by asking for and then accepting interbank offers in a reasonable market size just prior to 11 a.m? The phrasing matters. It does not ask what rate you did borrow at. It asks what rate you could borrow at. It is hypothetical by construction. This was not an accident of drafting. It was a deliberate design choice. The interbank lending market, particularly for longer tenors and for certain currencies, was not deep enough to produce a continuous stream of observable transactions every single day. A 3-month yen interbank loan does not occur on every desk every morning. So the benchmark was built on judgment. Each contributor bank assigned a submitter, a person whose job was to look at the funding market, consider where the bank could raise unsecured cash, and submit a number. The submissions were then processed by a trimming mechanism. For each currency and each tenor, the contributing bank's submissions were ranked. The highest quartile and the lowest quartile were discarded. The remaining middle submissions were averaged. That trimmed mean became the published LIBOR fixing for that currency and tenor that day. The trimming was the system's only structural defense against manipulation. The theory was that no single bank could move the average, because outlier submissions would be trimmed away before the average was computed. Consider what that benchmark was supposed to do legitimately. It was a reference rate. A floating rate loan could be written as LIBOR plus a margin. An interest rate swap could exchange a fixed payment for a floating payment indexed to LIBOR. A bundle of mortgages, securitized, could pay investors a coupon that reset against LIBOR. The benchmark was the connective tissue of the floating rate world. Its entire utility depended on one property, that it was an objective, external, untainted reference. Neither party to a contract could control it. Both parties accepted it precisely because it was beyond the reach of either. That property was the value of LIBOR. And that property is exactly what the mechanism failed to protect. Now, observe the structural vulnerability sitting inside the design. The submission was an estimate of a hypothetical borrowing cost. It required no underlying transaction. There was no obligation to demonstrate that any borrowing had occurred at the submitted rate or near it. or at all. The submitter was, in the language of valuation, marking to model rather than marking to market. And the model was the submitter's own judgment. This is the device at the center of the fraud. We can name it precisely. It was a mark-to-model benchmark with no transaction backstop. When a price is marked to market, an external transaction disciplines it. You cannot claim an asset is worth 100 when the market just traded it at 60. But when a price is marked to model, the only discipline is the integrity of the person operating the model. The LIBOR submission had no transaction backstop. The submitter's judgment was both the input and the entire control. There was a second structural feature, and it is the one that converts vulnerability into opportunity. The submitter at a contributor bank did not sit in isolation. The submitter sat inside a trading institution. Elsewhere in that same institution were derivatives traders holding positions whose value moved with the published fixing. A trader holding a swap that paid him when 3-month yen LIBOR fixed high had a direct financial interest in the number the submitter submitted. The submitter and the trader worked for the same firm. In some cases, they sat on the same floor. In some cases, the record shows they were the same conversation away from each other. The legitimate firewall would have required the submission process to be entirely insulated from the trading book. The submitter's number was supposed to reflect the bank's true funding cost and nothing else. The trader's position was supposed to be irrelevant to it. Hold those two facts together. The benchmark had no transaction backstop, and the people who submitted to it worked alongside people who profited from where it landed. The fraud is the collapse of the distance between those two facts. How was the mechanism deployed? The public enforcement record permits us to draw the architecture with precision. We will build it in steps. Step 1. The trader identifies the exposure. A derivatives trader runs a book of instruments indexed to LIBOR. On any given fixing date, the trader can calculate the profit and loss impact of a movement in the fixing. The record establishes that for a large book, a single basis point movement in a yen LIBOR tenor on a key fixing date could be worth a substantial sum. The trader knows before 11 a.m. which direction he needs the fixing to move and how much it is worth to him. This is not estimation after the fact. The exposure is known in advance. That was the precondition for the entire scheme. The trader has a quantified interest in tomorrow morning's number. Step 2. The trader reaches the submitter inside his own bank. At UBS, the record shows the distance between the trading desk and the rate submitter was small enough to cross with a request. The trader would communicate the direction he needed. He needed the bank's submission high or low, depending on his book. The submitter, rather than submitting the bank's genuine assessment of its funding cost, would adjust the submission toward the trader's preference. Because the submission required no transaction to support it, no falsification of records was necessary at the point of submission. The submitter simply exercised judgment in the direction requested. The judgment was the product, and the judgment was now corrupted by the position. Step 3. The trader recognizes the limit of Step 2. One bank's submission, on its own, will frequently be trimmed away. Recall the design. The top and bottom quartiles are discarded. A single bank pushing its submission to an extreme risks landing in the trimmed region where it has no effect on the published average at all. So, moving the bank's own submission is necessary but not sufficient. To reliably move the published fixing, the trader needs several banks' submissions moving in the same direction at once. He needs to move enough of the middle of the distribution that the trimmed mean shifts. This is the structural reason the scheme required a network. The trimming mechanism, the system's only defense, did not prevent manipulation. It dictated the form manipulation had to take. It forced coordination. A lone bad submitter could be trimmed out. A coordinated cluster of submitters could move the mean. The defense in operation selected for conspiracy. Step 4. The trader reaches the other banks. He does not work at the other banks. He cannot instruct their submitters directly, so he uses an intermediary who can reach across institutions. That intermediary was the interdealer broker. We must be precise about what an interdealer broker is, because the role is the hinge of the architecture. A broker in the cash and derivatives markets sits between banks. He matches buyers and sellers. He talks all day to the desks at every major institution. He is trusted. He carries information about where the market is and where it is going. Submitters at contributor banks, when forming their own judgment about where to submit, would sometimes ask brokers what they were seeing in the market. The broker's view was an input into the submitter's judgment. That is the legitimate function. Now observe how it was deployed. The trader at UBS would tell the broker the direction he needed. The broker, in turn, would communicate to submitters at other panel banks a suggested level for that day's fixing. He would present it as his read of the market. The submitters at the other banks, some of whom had no yen position and no particular view, would take the broker's suggestion as informed market colour and submit accordingly. The record describes this as the use of brokers to disseminate misinformation about appropriate submission levels to panel banks. There is a refinement to step 4 worth isolating because it shows how thoroughly the transaction backstop had been hollowed out. The broker, in some instances, would send the panel banks a daily communication purporting to summarize where cash was trading and where the fixings ought to print. These were described in the market as run-throughs. A submitter receiving such a run-through might reasonably treat it as independent market intelligence. But the run-through, in the corrupted instances the record establishes, was shaped to the direction a particular trader had requested and paid for. The submitter was marking to a model whose inputs had been deliberately contaminated upstream, and he did not know it. The contamination travelled along the exact channel the benchmark relied on for its judgment. Step 5. The compensation. The intermediary's effort had to be motivated. The record establishes that brokers were compensated for their assistance. In some instances, the inducement was crude and small. The curry lunch from the cold open is a documented example, and it is instructive precisely because it is small. The point is not that the favour was expensive. The point is that the benchmark could be nudged for the price of lunch, because moving it required no capital, no transaction, and no risk. The submission was free to move. Its only cost was the cost of asking. In other instances, the compensation was larger and structured. The record describes arrangements in which a bank would route trades through a particular broker, generating commission in exchange for the broker's assistance in influencing submissions. There were also arrangements described as wash trades. A wash trade is a pair of offsetting transactions that have no net economic purpose and no net risk. The trades cancel. What they generate is brokerage commission. The record establishes that such risk-free, purposeless trades were used to channel payment to brokers as compensation for their role in the submission scheme. Read structurally, The wash trade is the settlement layer of the conspiracy. It converts the favor into a fee, disguised as ordinary market activity. Now, assemble the architecture. At the center sits the trader with a quantified position in the fixing. To his side sits the submitter at his own bank who will move the home submission. Beyond his own bank sit the rival panel banks, which he cannot reach directly. Bridging that gap sits the broker, who can reach the rival submitters and who shapes their judgment through suggested levels and run-throughs. Compensating the broker is a payment channel, commission, routed trades, wash trades. And governing the whole structure is the trimming mechanism, which is the reason a network is required rather than a single corrupt desk. That is the org chart. The trader, the home submitter, the broker, the foreign submitters, the payment channel, and the trimmed mean they were all working to move. The number that emerged from that structure was then published by the British Bankers Association as an objective benchmark. Contracts around the world repriced against it. The party who had paid for lunch collected on his swap. The contract counterparty on the other side, who had accepted LIBOR precisely because it was supposed to be beyond either party's reach, paid the difference and never knew the reference had been moved. If the architecture was as described, why did it persist? Why did the gatekeepers not catch it? This is the detection failure, and it is a structural failure, not a failure of attention. Begin with the most fundamental problem. There was nothing to audit. Recall that the submission required no transaction. An auditor examining a bank's LIBOR submissions could not compare them against a record of actual borrowings, because the benchmark did not require actual borrowings. The submission was an opinion submitted in the direction a trader preferred looks, on paper, identical to an opinion submitted in good faith. There is no document that distinguishes them. The corrupted submission left no forensic trace at the point of submission because the corruption was in the judgment, and judgment is not a record. This is the deepest consequence of a mark-to-model benchmark with no transaction backstop. Marks to market can be checked against the market. Marks to model can be checked only against the model and the integrity of the modeler. When the modeler is compromised, the output is compromised without leaving evidence in the output. To detect this manipulation, an examiner would have had to read the trader's communications, not the submissions, the communications. The fraud lived in the chat messages, not in the rate file. And no routine audit of a benchmark submission process was reading the trader's chats against the submitter's numbers, because no one had structured the oversight to assume the two were connected. Consider next the position of the rival bank's compliance functions. A submitter at a panel bank receiving a broker's run-through had no obvious reason to treat it as suspect. Brokers supplied market color routinely. That was their function. The submitter accepting a broker's suggested level was, from his own seat, doing his ordinary job. The contamination was invisible from inside the receiving bank because the channel carrying it was a legitimate channel. You cannot detect a poisoned input when the input arrives through the pipe that is supposed to carry good inputs. Now, consider the benchmark administrator. The British Bankers Association published the rate. It was a trade association. It was not a regulator. It had no examination authority over the contributor banks, no power to demand a bank justify its submission against transaction records, and in any case, the submission was definitionally exempt from such justification because it was hypothetical. The administrator collected estimates and computed a trimmed mean. The administrator's role was clerical, not investigative. There was no body whose job was to verify that the estimates were honest, because the entire architecture had assumed they would be. The benchmark rested on an assumption of contributor integrity that no institution was charged with testing. Then there is the question that arose during the financial crisis, and which, for a period, masked the manipulation behind a different concern. During the crisis, banks' submissions were scrutinized for a separate reason. A high LIBOR submission signaled that a bank believed its own funding cost was high, which signaled distress. The record and subsequent regulatory findings established that some banks lowered submissions during this period to avoid appearing weak. This was a different motive from the trader-driven manipulation, but it had a crucial side effect on detection. When observers noticed submissions behaving oddly, the available explanation was the reputational one: banks managing the appearance of their funding health in a crisis. That explanation absorbed the suspicion. The trader-driven, position-based manipulation continued underneath a narrative that accounted for the anomalies in other terms. What would have had to be true for earlier detection? 3 things structurally. First, someone with authority would have had to be reading the trader's communications against the submitter's numbers, looking for correlation between book exposure and submission direction. That cross-reference was the only place the fraud was visible, and no gatekeeper was positioned to perform it. Second, the broker run-throughs would have had to be treated as potential vectors of manipulation rather than as neutral market color, which would have required someone to model the broker not as an information source, but as a possible conduit. Third, the benchmark itself would have had to be understood as a regulated object, subject to oversight of contributor conduct, rather than as a private trade association statistic. None of those 3 conditions held. The detection failure was not that the gatekeepers were inattentive. It was that the verification chain had no link positioned at the point where the fraud actually lived. The unraveling did not begin with an auditor. It began, as such things often do, with regulators pulling on the crisis-era thread for their own reasons and finding the other scheme underneath. The sequence, as the public record establishes it, ran roughly as follows. Regulators in multiple jurisdictions opened inquiries into LIBOR submissions in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Document and communication production was compelled from the contributor banks. And once investigators obtained the traders' and submitters' electronic communications, the architecture that had been invisible to auditors became visible in plain language. The communications were explicit. Traders asked submitters for specific levels. Submitters confirmed they would accommodate. Traders thanked brokers. Brokers confirmed they had passed requests to other banks. The record that the audit process could never produce, the link between exposure and submission, existed all along in the chat logs. It simply required someone with subpoena power to read them. The enforcement actions that followed established the mechanism on the record. Settlements with contributor banks documented the practice. UBS entered into resolutions with authorities in the United States and the United Kingdom. The findings described the coordination between traders and submitters, the use of brokers to influence other panel banks, and the inducements offered. The conduct was no longer characterized as an inference from anomalous data. It was characterized from the participants' own words. The individual case named in this episode's title proceeded to trial in the United Kingdom. The trader was prosecuted on conspiracy to defraud. The prosecution's case described the manner in which he had requested favourable submissions and coordinated across institutions through brokers. The jury convicted. The conviction established, as a matter of legal finding in that jurisdiction, that the conduct constituted a dishonest scheme to manipulate the benchmark. We confine ourselves to what the verdict established, that the coordination of submissions to move the fixing in the direction of a trader's book was found to be a fraud. Observe how the mechanism collapsed once exposed. The entire value of LIBOR had rested on a single property, that it was beyond the control of any interested party. The communications destroyed that property in retrospect and prospectively at once. Once it was demonstrated that the benchmark had been moved by interested parties, every contract that had priced against it during the relevant period became contestable. Counterparties who had paid out on swaps could now ask whether the reference had been honest. The benchmark could not survive the demonstration that it was reachable, because reachability was the one thing it had promised it was not. The fraud did not merely cost the manipulators their settlements, it invalidated the instrument. The brokers were prosecuted as well, with mixed outcomes across the cases, and we will not characterize the results beyond noting that the broker channel was placed squarely at the center of the legal accounts of how submissions at non-employing banks were reached. The structural point stands independent of any individual outcome. The broker was the bridge across institutions, and the cross-institution bridge was structurally necessary because of the trimming mechanism. You could not reliably move a trimmed mean from inside one bank. You needed the bridge. The financial consequences to the institutions were substantial. The aggregate of fines and settlements across the contributor banks ran into billions. But the more consequential outcome was structural, and it points us to the close. What does this case establish about the mechanism? It establishes that a benchmark constructed on unverified judgment governing instruments whose holders can influence that judgment will be moved, not might be moved. Will be moved, given a quantified incentive and a channel. The LIBOR architecture combined three features: a submission with no transaction backstop, submitters housed inside institutions holding positions in the outcome, and a trimming defense that, rather than preventing manipulation, dictated that manipulation take a coordinated form. Each feature alone was a weakness. Together they constituted a structure in which honest submission depended entirely on contributor integrity, with no external discipline to enforce it and no audit trace to detect its absence. The regulatory response addressed the mechanism at its root. Oversight of the benchmark was transferred from a trade association to a financial regulator. The administration of LIBOR was moved to an entity subject to regulatory authority. Submission to a benchmark and the manipulation of one was brought within the explicit scope of market abuse and criminal regimes in a way that closed the gap the trade association structure had left open. And the deeper reform addressed the transaction backstop directly. The long arc of benchmark reform moved away from judgment-based submissions toward rates anchored in observable transactions. The successor reference rates were designed to be computed from actual, completed transactions in deep markets, precisely so that there would be a transaction backstop where LIBOR had none. LIBOR itself was wound down and its publication ceased for its principal settings. The finding is narrow, and it is structural. A price marked to model, with no transaction to discipline it, is only as honest as the party operating the model. When that party holds a position in the outcome, the model is not a measurement. It is an instrument of the position. LIBOR was, for the relevant period and the relevant tenors, an instrument of the positions held by the people permitted to influence it. The reform did not appeal to the integrity of submitters. It removed the dependence on that integrity by requiring the transaction backstop the original design had omitted. That is the correct response to the mechanism, because it does not ask people to behave. It removes the structure that made misbehavior both profitable and invisible. The curry lunch is not the point. The point is that a benchmark governing an estimated $350 trillion in contracts could be nudged for the price of lunch, because moving it required no transaction at all. The cost of the manipulation was low because the structure had set the cost low. The reform raised the cost by reintroducing the one thing a price needs in order to be trusted: a transaction behind it. That is the forensic finding. A mark-to-model benchmark without a transaction backstop, operated by parties with positions in its output, is not a measurement of anything. It is a surface onto which those positions are projected. The record establishes that this is what LIBOR became. The reform establishes what was required to undo it.